And welcome back to TIA 2014, day 2 of our 3-day conference on the Network of the Future here in Dallas, Texas. With us in the Dell TIA NOW studio to talk about cloud NFV technologies is Sandra Rivera. She's the Director of Market Development for Communications and Storage Infrastructure, or the Communications Storage Infrastructure Group at Intel. Sandra, I'll get that right one of these days. Thanks for being here, by the way.
Thanks, Abe.
Yeah, I know you're off to vacation later today, but we appreciate your time and being here. I know you've been all over the planet in the last few weeks.
Yeah,
so.
always happy to talk with you guys.
Well, we appreciate it. Want to talk about NFV technologies, but not so much our discussions in the past about what NFV is and getting it from the proof of concept to deployment, but more about the deployment stage. What are some of the challenges around operations in that deployment stage right now?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we have been in a period of time where we've been focused quite a bit on proof of concepts and proving the technical feasibility of using more general purpose processing technology in the network, and really that whole abstraction of the hardware from the software that runs the platforms and the applications. And now that we've entered into this phase of trials and early deployments, the questions that are being asked now really are more, what does it take to really operationalize, institutionalize this new approach to network architecture? Things like management and orchestration of not just hundreds of virtual machines, but hundreds of thousands, sometimes really maybe millions of virtual machines in some of these broader implementations. Issues around business practice re-engineering, restructuring that would have to happen in terms of moving from a network architecture that's been largely based in hardware to one where it's a virtual pool of resources that need to be administered, that needs to still adhere to service level agreements, to quality of service expectations. So it's much more on that implementation set of questions, the business processes questions, the SLA adherence and policy enforcement questions, and not really, as you mentioned, is this technically possible? I think for the most part everyone's kind of checked that one off. But the rate at which it will be adopted will depend on answering some of these other richer questions, perhaps. You
mentioned SLAs, and I'm glad you did. How are service level agreements evolving based on this deployment stage of NFV?
Well, I don't think there's any change in expectations from the customers that they will have the level of service for which they have applied and paid. But much of the opportunity that exists to move or to leverage, I should say, the technologies, the levels of innovation, the types of business models from the cloud and data center world and apply them to the network does mean that there are issues around those guaranteed levels of service. The service provider industry, the communications networking industry, is a highly regulated industry. It is much more rigorous in terms of the types of platform performance and reliability expectations. And so when we look at some of the service level considerations, we do see a need to, in that underlying physical infrastructure, that substrate, if you will, of the compute, networking, and storage capabilities, to be able to message up what is my state of health, what is my availability to be used for particular applications on an on-demand basis, and from that perspective, how do I then guarantee that those resources are available to the applications, adhering to the policies and SLAs that have been predetermined for the customers.
Sandra, as you know, there's a supplier conference hosted by AT&T tomorrow here at TIA 2014. And I guess the general gist, if you will, of that event is to invite multiple vendors into your circle of supply chain, if you will, again. How is the paradigm shifting from your perspective as you have to deal with multiple vendors and not just one or two of them?
Yeah. Well, the Supplier Domain 2.0 announcement by AT&T was one of those seminal events, I think, in our journey towards this transformed network to take advantage of server virtualization, cloud technologies. And the reason is that, as you point out, it really became a leveling of everyone really being invited to become a solution provider to Tier 1 network operators. So inviting in a lot broader participation requires a level of interoperability that is expected, a level of performance that is still expected, and that is more difficult to do when you move from, of course, a handful of suppliers to now saying, hey, we want to really expand the level of innovation, the rate of innovation, and have many more participants. So this is where it's critical to understand how we are influencing within the standards bodies to establish some level of expectations around interoperability when you come to the table with a solution, how you're indeed abstracting that software layer and the application layer from the underlying hardware in a deterministic way. And for us, we have been very committed to that contribution around the interoperability and really the technical enabling around a broad set of industry participants.
So Sandra, does Domain 2.0 in their approach run parallel to Intel's ecosystem enablement approach? Is that a little bit of the same thing?
It's very much aligned, and it's interesting because when you look at our own ecosystem efforts around transformation of the network, which we have a program called Network Builders within Intel. We have about 70 participants, member companies today, but if you look at that AT&T list, all of them are really on that list today that AT&T has selected. But beyond that, we worked quite closely with the service providers to ensure that we are inviting in some of the target companies that they're also working with, both large and small. So I think that we all recognize that in order to increase the level of innovation, you have to increase the level of participation, and the way to do that is to lower those barriers to entry, and that is done through technical enabling work, of course, that we would do ourselves, and of course many of the solution providers would do to onboard those applications onto their platforms. But this issue of interoperability, standards, whether they're de facto or formal standards, really is critical in order to enable that broader market participation.
Sandra, as you know, there's a big concern by carriers like AT&T about how they're going to reintegrate their legacy hardware equipment back into these software-defined networks. What's Intel's position on that?
Well, that's actually an excellent question, because we understand that certainly the tier ones that have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in existing infrastructure are not going to simply put that to bed and just roll out all new hardware. There's clearly opportunities for greenfield deployments with the tier ones, and so they're trying to manage, how do I cap what I have today in terms of the current architectural model, and then invest in some of the new opportunities. But in all cases, they still will have to peacefully coexist. And the way to do that is through an abstraction of the underlying physical infrastructure from not only the applications, but also the management and orchestration layer. And we believe that if we're doing that abstraction, again, in a way that establishes a set of standard approaches for how to integrate to the existing OSS and BSS platforms, all the operational and billing systems that exist to run the legacy infrastructure, while extending out capabilities to a new architectural model, that it will indeed help address the question of, how do I still have two architectural models peacefully coexisting and an overriding set of applications that want to make use of both those, both of that physical infrastructure.
Sandra, you mentioned briefly earlier about ETSI, and you also mentioned that they influence the standard, they don't necessarily create the standard. Why is that an important, significant item to note?
Yeah, well, the thing about the ETSI NFV ISG, the Industry Specifications Group that was formed, as you know, in the fall of 2012, is that they wanted to move very quickly. And in order to move quickly, they concluded that they would not set standards themselves. They would set forth the specifications, and then really what came out of, or what would come out of those specifications would be to upstream and influence those standards development organizations. And I think that it's been largely, I mean, wildly successful, really. If you look at the number of specifications that have been accepted and documented, if you look at the number of proof of concepts, I think when we last spoke on the heels of Mobile World Congress, there was an NFV meeting of the ISG right on the heels of that in Malaga in Spain, and there were 9 approved proof of concepts at that point in time. That has grown to, in late April, at the subsequent meeting in Okinawa, to 18, and today I just checkpointed it, and we're up over 20. So the specifications, the proof of concepts, the level of complexity that they're trying to address for things like how do you handle DDoS attacks when you have this distributed network now that is not so centrally managed? How do you have hierarchical QoS types of platform QoS considerations that are enforcing the policies and adhering to the SLAs? Just performance issues in terms of failover and live migration. I mean, all these kinds of issues are now being addressed in those proof of concepts, but ultimately the actual implementations need to happen elsewhere, and those would be happening in places like OpenStack and the IETF and even a new project that the Linux Foundation is putting forward for an open platform for NFV, which is really that implementation phase. Back to your earlier question around how do you address the operational issues? Well, you only do that by getting in market, and I think that that's what ETSI is looking to now drive a lot of that implementation to the standards development organizations and some of these other projects that exist in the market.
Sandra, we have the TIA Now has the pleasure of getting updated by the folks over at Intel, more you than others, and that's a pleasure for us to have that information from you. I wanted to find out in the next 2 or 3 months, when we have the pleasure of doing that again, what can we expect to hear from you?
Well, we remain committed to our strategy, which is to be a technology leader, and so continuing to innovate on not only our microarchitecture and silicon process technology and all the instruction sets that we put into the silicon to address communications networking requirements for special I/O that's required for network infrastructure, certainly bandwidth, latency, jitter issues, security issues in the actual silicon itself, and of course all the software innovations that we've got with our data plane development kit, DPDK, but other things, DPDK, optimize Open vSwitch, and of course the contributions that we're making into OpenStack for enhanced platform awareness so that you really know what you have underneath to take advantage of in the application. But beyond the technology leadership, we are completely committed to the ecosystem enabling aspect and the importance of having a broader market participation, and our Intel Network Builders community has grown to, as I said, over 70 members from launching last September with just over 25. We're actually running an innovation contest that we'll announce at IDF, our Intel Developer Forum in September, the winners. So we were trying to, again, spur innovation, and we have some nice prizes associated with that. And then finally, the standards, commitment to standards leadership and contribution. So you'll see us quite active, continue to be active in ETSI, continue to be active in OpenStack, also this emerging project within the Linux Foundation, and of course IETF, ONF, and some of the others. So those are probably the 3 areas that we'll be able to update on when we meet again.
Is that all, Sandra? We have a panel later on today with 2 other leaders in the industry, so we're looking forward to that. We appreciate you coming in, and we'll see you at the conference.
Okay, thanks, Abe.
Thanks, Sandra. And thanks again for joining us for our coverage of TIA's Network of the Future. The Dell TIA Now studio will be streaming live throughout the conference. You can view our live stream and all of our programming at tianow.org. So long.